Amidst a vast and silent sea of water, the veteran Cole was nearly exhausted. He was about to turn his boat back, but his German Shepherd Ranger suddenly acted strangely. It barked loudly towards a house already marked clear, an absurd challenge to the rescue protocol. Trusting his companion's instincts, Cole steered the boat closer. A faint silhouette on the rooftop gradually appeared, something he initially mistook for just a pile of debris. But as he got closer, his heart seemed to stop. It wasn't debris. It was an old man, motionless, almost blending into the tragic scene just moments from death. To see how this breathtaking rescue unfolds and the incredible truth behind it, please support us by subscribing to the channel. Where are you listening to this story from? The world had been reduced to the color of mud and sorrow. For 3 days, the only sounds in the small Louisiana town were the mournful sigh of the wind and the low hum of the John boat's motor. At its helm stood Cole, a man whose 40-something years were etched onto a kind face, the short brown hair at his temples now streaked with the silver of exhaustion. A former Navy man, his tall, lean frame was still strong, but it slumped with the weight of the grim work. The flood had taken everything, leaving behind a silent brown sea where homes and lives used to be. At the bow of the boat, a steadfast statue of muscle and fur, sat Ranger. He was a magnificent German Shepherd, his coat a striking blend of gray and white, his intelligent eyes scanning the horizon. He was 5 years old, bred for discipline but bound to Cole by a loyalty that transcended any training. They were navigating what was once a quiet suburban street. The tops of mailboxes and roofs were the only tombstones marking what lay beneath. Most had a large, spray-painted X on them, the universal sign from the rescue teams that had passed through before. Checked. Empty. Cole was about to turn the boat toward the main channel, his mind already on the dwindling fuel supply, when Ranger's posture shifted. The dog's ears, which had been relaxed, shot forward. A low growl rumbled in his chest, and then it came. A single sharp bark that cut through the oppressive silence. He was staring intently at a 2-story house, its upper floor just above the water line, an orange X clearly visible on its siding. Cole clicked his tongue. "Easy, boy. That one's been cleared." Ranger ignored him. He moved to the very edge of the bow, his body tense, and barked again, this time with a desperate insistence that sent a chill down Cole's spine. The dog looked back at him, his eyes pleading, then turned again to the house, letting out a series of resonant barks that echoed across the water. Cole knew that look. It was the same focus Ranger used to find a training dummy buried under a dozen blankets, an unwavering certainty that defied all logic. Protocol said to move on. His gut and his trust in the animal before him screamed otherwise. All right," Cole sighed, cutting the engine. "Show me what you see." He grabbed a paddle and guided them silently closer, the only sound now the gentle lapping of water against the hull. As they drifted near the roof, Cole scanned the shingles, seeing nothing but sodden debris, and then his breath caught. It wasn't a pile of leaves, it was an arm. An old man, his white hair plastered to his skull, lay motionless on the ridge of his roof, his soaked clothes making him nearly invisible. He was utterly still. In the echoing chaos of the high school gymnasium turned shelter, the old man was an island of absolute silence. They had learned his name was Samuel from a worn-out driver's license, but the name was just a label for a hollow shell. He sat on a cot, wrapped in a gray army blanket, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the far wall, beyond the noise of crying children and weary volunteers. He was frail, the skin stretched thin over his knuckles, yet there was a stubborn set to his jaw, a remnant of a strength that had long since been submerged. Cole felt an unexplainable pull towards him, checking on him a dozen times a day, offering water that went untouched, and words that vanished into the void. Ranger seemed to understand, lying quietly at Cole's feet whenever they approached, never whining or nudging, as if respecting the profound depth of the man's grief. After 3 days, the water had retreated, leaving a scar of mud and ruin across the landscape. The roads were barely passable, but Cole knew he had to take Samuel back. The journey was silent. When they arrived, the devastation seen from the water was magnified 100 times on land. A thick layer of foul-smelling mud coated everything, and the overturned furniture of a lifetime lay scattered across the yard. Samuel stood motionless, his blank gaze sweeping over the wreckage of his life without a flicker of emotion. It was a scene of such total loss that Cole felt a wave of helplessness wash over him. But Ranger was not helpless. While Cole stood frozen, the German Shepherd began to pace anxiously. His nose twitched, and he trotted past a ruined sofa and a shattered television, making a direct line for a heavy oak cabinet that had been thrown against the side of the house. He began to whine, a high, urgent sound, before digging frantically at the mud-caked ground right beside it. Paws sent clumps of thick mud flying as he dug with a desperate focus. It was the same intensity from the rooftop, a signal that Cole had learned to trust more than his own eyes. Shaking himself from his stupor, he went to the cabinet. It took all of his strength to lever the waterlogged piece of furniture away. Where it had been, in the exact spot Ranger was clawing at, Cole saw the corner of something metallic. He knelt and dug with his bare hands, the cold mud sucking at his fingers, until he pulled a small, dented tin box free. It was surprisingly heavy. With a creak of protest from the rusted hinges, he pried it open. Inside, nestled on damp velvet, lay a few military medals, a small silver locket, and a photograph protected by a fading plastic sleeve. He carefully slid the picture out. Two young soldiers in uniform grinned at the camera, their arms slung around each other in easy camaraderie. One of them was a much younger, vibrant Samuel. Cole's heart stopped. The other soldier, the one with the familiar confident smile and kind eyes, was his own father. The name suddenly clicked into place, a key turning in a lock buried for decades. This was not a stranger. This was the Uncle Sam from his father's bedtime stories. Cole stared at the photograph, his knuckles white. The world seemed to shrink until only the grinning face of his father and the haunted face of the man before him remained. He looked up, his voice barely a whisper. Uncle Sam? The name, a relic of childhood stories, hung in the damp, heavy air. It did not bring a spark of happy recognition to Samuel's eyes. Instead, it broke the dam. The emptiness in his gaze was washed away by a tidal wave of pure, undiluted pain. For the first time, the old man spoke, his voice a dry rasp. He's gone, son. They're all gone. The words tumbled out, a torrent of grief held back for years. He spoke of his wife, Eleanor, the woman who was the anchor of his world. He explained how, after she died, this house was not just wood and nails, but a living museum of their half-century together. Every photograph, every piece of furniture, every worn-out book was a memory of her. The flood hadn't just taken his house, it had erased his wife a second time. And then came the most devastating confession, delivered with a chilling finality. I wasn't trapped on that roof, Samuel rasped, tears finally carving paths through the grime on his cheeks. I was waiting. I just wanted it to be over. Cole was paralyzed. The pride he'd felt in the rescue curdled into shock. He had saved a man who didn't want to be saved. He was a soldier, trained for action and objectives, but he had no training for this. No weapon to fight the enemy of utter despair that had conquered his father's best friend. The silence that fell between them was immense, filled with the weight of a life that had given up on itself. That was when Ranger, who had been sitting patiently, seemed to decide the humans had failed. The big shepherd rose with a quiet grace and walked over to where Samuel sat trembling on an overturned bucket. He didn't bark or whine. He simply nudged his wet nose gently into Samuel's limp hand. When the old man didn't respond, Ranger rested his heavy, noble head upon his knee and looked up, his dark eyes filled with a profound, unspoken understanding. It was a simple gesture, an offering of warmth and presence without question or judgment. And it was everything. That simple, honest connection from an animal broke through the wall of grief. A shudder ran through Samuel's frail body, and he let out a choked sob. Then, another. He buried his wrinkled hand in Ranger's thick fur, anchoring himself to the solid, living creature as decades of sorrow finally poured out of him. Cole watched, humbled. He had pulled a body from the water, but Ranger was pulling a soul back from the brink. In that moment he understood. The physical rescue was complete. The real mission, the war against despair, had just begun. That night, as Samuel rested fitfully on a cot, Cole made a decision. The battle for Samuel's spirit couldn't be fought alone. He sat on the tailgate of his truck, under the dim glow of a portable lantern, his phone in his hand. He didn't call for donations or assistance. He called for reinforcements. The conversations were short, the language direct, honed by years of shared experience where economy of words was a virtue. To a man named Sal in the next parish, he said, "I found one of our own, a Korean war vet. He was my dad's brother-in-arms, and he's lost everything." There was no hesitation on the other end of the line, just a simple question. "Where do you need us? And when?" Cole made 3 more calls. Each one the same. Each met with the same unwavering response. The old code was still alive. You don't leave your own behind, ever. 2 days later, the cavalry arrived. They didn't come on horseback, but in dusty pickup trucks and work vans that rumbled down the half-dried, muddy road. They were a motley crew of men, some in their 70s with faded divisional tattoos from Vietnam, others in their 30s bearing the quiet intensity of more recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. They were carpenters, plumbers, and electricians in their civilian lives, but today they were simply soldiers answering a call. The oppressive silence that had clung to Samuel's property was shattered by the rhythmic beat of hammers, the buzz of saws, and the gruff but good-natured shouts of men with a shared mission. They worked with a furious energy, tearing out the ruined, mud-caked walls and raising new frames, their movements efficient and synchronized. The air filled with the scent of fresh pine and the sound of laughter as they shared black coffee and stories, a brotherhood reforged in the Louisiana mud. And at the center of it all was Ranger. He became the official mascot of the rebuilding effort. The great German shepherd trotted between the workers, his tail a constant, wagging metronome of encouragement. He would supervise the work from a patch of shade, occasionally helping, by proudly carrying a stray wood chip to one of the men, a gesture that never failed to bring a smile. But his true mission was Samuel. The old man spent the first day sitting silently on a folding chair, a ghost at the edge of his own life's construction site. Ranger became his constant shadow, resting his head on Samuel's knee, nudging his hand for a gentle pat. Slowly, miraculously, the warmth began to seep in. On the second day, one of the veterans asked Samuel about the porch swing, and after a long pause, Samuel pointed. "It hung from that beam there," he said, his voice quiet. A few hours later, he was off his chair, showing a young Marine where a rose bush planted by his Eleanor used to be. A small, fragile smile touched his lips as he watched a new wall go up. He was no longer just watching his house being rebuilt. He was participating in the resurrection of his own hope. The weeks that followed saw a quiet miracle unfold on the muddy plot of land. The skeleton of a house grew flesh, its new walls painted a cheerful yellow, its windows gleaming, and its porch wide and welcoming. The scent of decay was replaced by the smell of fresh paint and newly turned earth in a small flower bed by the steps. The house was more than repaired, it was reborn. But the most profound transformation was not in the lumber and nails, it was in Samuel. The hollow-eyed man from the rooftop was gone. In his place stood a patriarch, his back a little straighter, a light of purpose in his eyes. He was no longer a lonely victim of the flood, but the respected elder of a makeshift family, an Uncle Sam, not just to Cole, but to the entire band of brothers who had rebuilt his home. One warm evening, long after the last truck had rumbled away, Cole and Samuel sat on the new porch swing, its gentle creak a peaceful rhythm in the twilight. Ranger lay at their feet, his head resting on his paws, content. The air was still, filled with the sound of cicadas tuning up for their nightly song. Samuel reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn, silver Zippo lighter. Its edges were smooth from years of handling. He didn't say a word, simply placed the cool metal into Cole's hand. Cole recognized it instantly from old photographs. As he held the small, heavy piece of his father's life, Samuel began to speak, his voice soft. He didn't tell a grand story of battle, but a quiet one, of a freezing night in a Korean foxhole. He told Cole how his father had used the last of his own rations to feed a young, terrified private, shielding the boy from the worst of the cold and fear with his own body, telling him stories of home until dawn. It was an act of courage no medal could ever recognize, a quiet moment of grace that defined the man Cole's father was. It was a memory that gave Cole his father back, not as a faded picture, but as a living, breathing presence. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple. The generational debt had been paid, but something far more valuable had been gained. Samuel, who had prayed for death on a lonely rooftop, had found a son and a future worth living for. Cole, who had known his father only through stories, had found a living connection to his past and a new definition of family. And at their feet lay Ranger, the gray and white shepherd who had started it all with a single insistent bark. He was the hero who had not only rescued a man from the water but had guided two souls lost in the floods of their own grief back to the shores of hope. The house stood strong behind them, no longer a monument to loss, but a beacon of hope, a testament to the fact that family can be built and that no one truly ever gets left behind. Sometimes the deepest wounds are the ones no one can see, and the greatest heroes are those who simply refuse to let us face our battles alone. Ranger's story is a powerful reminder that loyalty and love can rebuild any broken foundation, and that hope often arrives on four paws. If a special animal has been a hero in your life, we would be truly honored to read your story in the comments below. By liking this video and subscribing to Voice of Paws, you become part of a community that celebrates these incredible bonds. Your support allows our family to grow and share more tales just like this one. Our next story is waiting for you now, just a click away on your screen.